Hi, history buffs. Welcome to today's lesson on the Renaissance. Today, I'd like you to gather your supplies. You're going to need um, pen, pencil, colored pencil, something to write with. And you're going to need something to write on because today's lesson is going to have some big points that I'd like you to keep track of so that you'll have some notes to study for your end of unit test. So go ahead and pause the video, gather the materials that you need, and I will see you back here for the lesson. All right, so today we are starting, like I said, on the Renaissance. And the word Renaissance means a time of revival, which literally means rebirth. And so if you'll remember, Europe was completely devastated after the Dark Ages and the Black Death. And so this time of the Renaissance became known as the rebirth of Europe. So you're going to see, as we move on through this presentation, the different ways that Europe rebuilt itself. One of the reasons that the Renaissance came about was because due to what the people had just endured with the plague and the Dark Ages, there was a loss of confidence in the church. Prior to this, the citizens had been very religious, had relied on all sorts of religious beliefs to drive or answer for some of the things that were happening to them and around them in the world. Well, when they lost their confidence in the church, they began to focus on themselves as individuals rather than focusing on the religion. And so, as a result, society became much more secular, which means it was not as religious. So, because the focus was on oneself and on the individual, the Renaissance was an intellectual movement. And I say intellectual because it focused on three major things: art, architecture, literature. And there was some sciences in there as well. But they did focus on rebuilding or rebirthing Greek and Roman art. They wanted to pull back in those former things that made Rome great, that made Greece great. And so they began to replicate the art, architecture, and literature that they found from earlier times in the Roman Empire, what you studied when you were in sixth grade. Um, the Renaissance was based around a concept called humanism. Now, humanism is a thought system. It's a thought process that places the importance on the individual instead of on a divine being such as God or the gods and goddesses. It stresses that people were good and it encouraged people to look for rational ways to understand and to solve problems that were in the world. So before, it used to be, and you'll see this in some slides moving forward, that whatever the church said, whatever their religious beliefs believed, that is why things happened. Well, because that's the way it's meant to be. So, but because of the loss in confidence in the church, people started thinking for themselves and started realizing, whoa, wait a minute. That doesn't make sense. And so we're going to see how that plays into the Renaissance and how Europe was reborn. So Petrarch was known as the father of humanism, and he was a poet. And he popularized love stories and poems that um, the emphasis was more on an individual and not on the Almighty or on a God. So, where exactly did the Renaissance begin? So, when we start thinking about where what Europe looks like now, there was an Italian peninsula that was never united during the Middle Ages. And so during the Middle Ages, these independent city states began to develop. The first one was Florence. And Florence was controlled by um, a very wealthy family who were huge patrons of the arts, and they were the De Medicis. And they were wealthy from the standpoint of they were involved in banking. And so we're going to learn a little more about the De Medicis tomorrow and their legacy that they left across Florence. So Milan was one of the richest cities, though, because it controlled the trade route that ran through the Alps. So all trade kind of went through Milan. And then Venice was located on the Adriatic Sea, and it attracted trade from all over the world because whoever had sea routes, the sea trade routes went through Venice. So all three cities, however, did serve as trade centers, but Florence and Venice were larger. I'm sorry, Milan and Venice were larger. They all three had access to the Middle Eastern markets, and that's where you find the things of silk and the spices and things that were found in the Middle East. Republican governments, though, were ruled by elite families, and so we're going to look a little more at the governments as we move forward. So I want you to stop and think because I've given you a good bit of information already. What was the Renaissance? Where did it begin? And why did it begin here? So I want you to jot down your answer right now, the what, the where, and the why. So go ahead and pause the video and write down your answer. Okay, so we're going to look now at how did art change during the Renaissance? And new art that was produced during the Renaissance time reflected the humanistic change in thinking that we just talked about. And so I told you a few minutes ago that Venice's trade routes were primarily through waterways. And so as their trade increased, um, basically the rich became richer, and these wealthy Europeans chose to hire out or commission artists to create new works of art for them. And so they became collectors of art. Um, Medieval art focuses on the church and salvation. Renaissance art focuses on individuals and worldly matters. And so you can see the painting on the left depicts Mary holding baby Jesus. The painting on the right shows a person. It's focuses on an individual and not a group like what you see on the picture on the left. So paintings and sculptures were more realistic and they focused on emotion. And so artists began to utilize new techniques to help bring the art more to life, to help make it look more realistic. In the picture on the left, it's very two-dimensional. It's a very flat picture. But when you look at the Mona Lisa, the picture on the right, you can see that the artist has used certain techniques, and we're going to talk about what those are, to add some depth to her face, to add a sense of three-dimensional ness to it. So one of the first things that artists began to do is they began to use perspective. And perspective is the point of view for which you're viewing art from. So a linear perspective is going to add depth to it. It's going to make something look like it's set back. Um, Foreshortening um, creates you shorten the lines to create depth instead of elongating them. And so you can look at the picture on the far left that was done in the 1280s, and then look at how the art changed over the course of from the 1280s to the 1480s. So in just a very short amount of time, the art became, the picture on the far right is far more realistic in its appearance and the way it looks than the picture on the far left. And so that's kind of the advancements that were done with the use of perspective by artists. Another advancement was the blurring of lines to create depth. And so this is the a portrait of Mona Lisa, and she, you can, her nose looks three-dimensional, her eyes look three-dimensional, and it's because the artist has used shading and blurring of those lines. There's no harsh lines to create that sense of depth. So one of the first major artists we're going to look at is Michelangelo. And yeah, he's a Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle, but yeah, no, not. He was first an artist and a sculptor. So Michelangelo was born in a small town near Florence, and he was a very inspired man. And so some of the things that he did, he created this masterpiece, this sculpture of the biblical hero David. And if you look up close at the details in this sculpture, it's pretty phenomenal. David looks extremely realistic. This is a depiction of that's going to show the emotion, and this is a portrait or a picture of David and Goliath, and you can really see the anguish and the pain that's on the faces of the people that are in this piece of artwork. This, however, was not Michelangelo, but equally as important, it does show emotion. Michelangelo did, however, paint the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, and there were 9 scenes from the book of Genesis in the Bible. Pope Julius hired Michelangelo only a year after he finished the sculpture of David, and which was odd that he hired him to be a painter, because Michelangelo didn't particularly, he wasn't really a painter, he was a sculptor. So as a result, it took him 4 years to finish. Here's up close, the separation of light and darkness. This is on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. And then he created this marble sculpture called La Pieta, and this was in almost 1500, 1499. And this is all the same sculpture, but it's from different, the cameras from different angles, so that you can really see just the detail and the emotion that is on, that are on the faces of these subjects in this sculpture. He also did a sculpture of Moses. Again, you can really see the emotion and the detail and the life-likeness of Moses. So Leonardo da Vinci was another artist, except that he wasn't just an artist. He was what I call a jack of all trades. He could do it all. He was a painter, he was a sculptor, he was an architect, he was an engineer, he was a scientist. He was truly, he epitomized Renaissance and what the Renaissance meant in thinking and vision. And Leonardo da Vinci was truly, truly a genius. So he painted the Mona Lisa, which we've now seen a couple of other times, and this was a portrait for the wife of a wealthy silk merchant, and she wanted a portrait of herself, and so he started to paint this. We're going to learn a fun little fact in a few minutes about the Mona Lisa.
Leonardo!
He's not in.
Yes, you are in.
Ciao, Lisa.
Don't you ciao, Lisa me. Where is my portrait? It's still not a finish.
I'm very busy.
It's been 12 years since you started, Leonardo.
What can I say? I've got too much to do. I'm not just a painter. I'm a sculptor, an architect, a musician, a scientist, a mathematician, an engineer, an anatomist, a geologist, a cartographer, a botanist, a writer and inventor.
Ah, an inventor. What a rubbish you inventor here, huh?
It's a glider. It's to fly through the air.
I make you fly through the air. I kick your butt.
Funny.
And I thought you said my portrait was going to be a masterpiece. Look at it. It's a tiddly.
It's bellissima. I even give you the enigmatic smile. You never smile for real.
You know the problem with you? You never finish anything. You're not even finished getting dressed.
Okay, that's true. But that's not fair, because there's a bit...
You're not even finished your sentence.
Can we finish this argument tomorrow? I have a very important mathematical problem I need to solve.
Tomorrow. You're a procrastinator.
Maybe I'll do something about being a procrastinator tomorrow.
Ugh!
It's a joke. I'm making a joke.
The only joke around here is you. Now you finish my painting, or this is supper, it'll be your last supper. Capiche?
The Last Supper. That's the only painting I ever finished. No wonder they call her the Mona Lisa. She's horrible.
All right, so you heard him say that at that point in time, The Last Supper was one of the only pieces of artwork that he had finished, and he did this piece of work. It is a beautiful piece of religious work that shows the last meal of Jesus before his crucifixion. And you've probably seen this before and didn't realize who the painter actually was. So now you are going to know. He was very famous for his notebooks. He sketched, and they kind of showed this in the little clip. He was always writing things down, jotting things down, and he had a ton of notebooks. And he was really particularly fascinated with the human anatomy, and he kept great detailed pictures where he had drawn sketches of the human body. He developed several prototypes for inventions, ball bearings and the helicopter, and we're going to see another cute little video in a minute.
Radical Renaissance! Next into the den is Leonardo da Vinci, best known as a famous painter, but also responsible for some amazing inventions that truly are ahead of their time.
So, Mr. Da Vinci, what have you got for us?
This you are gonna like. It's for a man to fly. He glide like the bird.
Leonardo has designed the original hang glider.
You want me to fly? I fly so I can poop on your head. This idea is stupid. I'm out.
Okay, how about this?
What is this? A device for making people laugh? It works!
No, it's a helicopter for flying.
Mr. Da Vinci, the only place this idea is getting off of the ground is in your dreams. I'm out.
Do you have anything that doesn't involve the flying?
Well, I do have this.
What's that?
Oh, sorry, that's a painting I'm working on. It's called the Mona Lisa.
I'm not surprised she's a Mona. You're painting a very rubbish.
I meant to show you this. It's an armored vehicle for war. It's for killing lots and lots of people without ever getting killed yourself.
Mr. Da Vinci, how many of these have you sold?
None.
How many of these have you built?
None.
I'm out.
Okay, just one more go.
The dragons are beginning to tire of Leonardo, but will this last idea persuade them?
What do you say to this?
Don't shoot!
How much you like?
Take everything.
Grazie mille. Che bella.
Leonardo was incredibly gifted. When he wasn't painting masterpieces, he was inventing amazing new machines. Just imagine how annoying it would be to have him for a brother. And he wasn't the only super talented Renaissance man.
Michelangelo! Michelangelo! Michelangelo!
Oh, sorry, Your Holiness. Didn't see it on there.
You've deliberately ignored every instruction I've given you.
Sorry.
OK, can you come down here now, please, Michelangelo, please?
Have you got your stick with you?
Unfortunately, no. Down here, please!
OK, look, make this quick here. I'm busy.
I just want to know when you... Hello? Would you look at me, please?
I can't. I've developed a severe case of ceiling painter's neck from painting your stupid ceiling, which basically means I can't look down, clever clogs.
Ooh, what's that smell?
Well, I can't smell anything.
I think it's your feet. When was the last time you took your shoes off?
3, maybe 4 months ago?
Ew, don't even take them off at night. That's disgusting.
Well, you can talk. You're always wearing that hat.
I'm supposed to. I'm a pope. It's a pope hat, innit?
Look, what do you want?
I want to know how long this is going to take. I mean, you call yourself a painter?
No, I don't. I hate painting. I told you that. I'm a sculptor. You're the one who bullied me into painting your stupid ceiling in the first place. And quite frankly, I don't see why you wanted 343 biblical figures up there anyway.
I didn't. I wanted 12.
Oh, fair point.
I mean, it's only a ceiling for pity's sake. It's not as if anyone's going to go, oh, wow, have you seen the ceiling at the Sistine Chapel? It's breathtaking. Are there? Eh? Now, get up there and get it finished. And if it's not finished by the end of next month, I'm going to climb up there and throw you off that scaffold.
You and whose army?
Me and my army. I've got an actual army, haven't I?
Oh, yeah. I forgot.
Yeah. Not so clever now, are you? Eh? Where do you
Sorry.
And Michelangelo, remember it's a church. Keep it clean.
Oops.
Measly middle-aged.
All right. So, pretty funny. You kind of got the humor at the end. Quick check 3. In what ways did art change in the Renaissance, and how did it reflect the broader changes taking place in society? So go ahead and pause the video and answer that question in your notebooks. All right, section 4 is we're going to look at literature and how literature and the spread of literature, what that looked like in the Renaissance. So before the Renaissance, books were copied by hand, and it was done by monks who lived in monasteries, and really the only thing that they copied at that point in time was the Bible, because that is primarily what people read. Now, it took one monk, about 20 years to copy a Bible from the beginning to the end, and they would sit every day and write and write and write using a quill pen, ink, and they would copy from one Bible into the pages of another. So there was this is a Chinese wood block, and you can see it is a block of wood that has been carved. And it kind of makes like similar to what we would think of in today as a stamp, where you would put the ink over it and then you would press it to the page. The wood block printing did make book production faster. However, you can imagine how long it would take to carve out words and how many pieces of wood you would have to make the Bible or another piece of text. So along came Johannes Gutenberg, and he forever changed the way printing was done in 1455, and it really sped up the process. So with his invention of the movable type, he would take, it was still the concept was the same in that it was like a stamp, but each letter was independent of another. And so you would slide letters together, and then they would go in a frame, and then you would write a page with all the letters done together, and then you would stamp it onto the blank sheet. So you might be able to set up the type page and stamp 100 copies, and then you'd take all those letters off and slide new ones on and print the next page. And so it did really speed up the rate at which books and other pieces of text were printed. The Gutenberg Bible was the first major book that was printed using this movable type, and like I said, it allowed for mass production of the Bible, which eventually led to the spread of Christianity, because Bibles became more readily available, and they were cheap and people could get them, whereas before they used to be rare, because if something took a monk 20 years, they're not going to have a bunch of those laying around. So therefore, once the Bible began to get into the hands of people, Christianity began to spread. Erasmus was a Dutch humanist, and he actually wanted vernacular forms of the Bible so that it became more accessible to different people, meaning he wanted the Bible in multiple languages. And this first happened with Martin Luther and the German Bible. And he believed that, is it so bad that the uneducated can't read it? And it's that the strength of the religion Christianity was by people who were ignorant, who had to rely on others, and so for what the Word of God was. And so we're going to talk more about Martin Luther in a few minutes, but Sir Thomas More was an English humanist, and he wrote the book Utopia, which focused on a perfect society. Now, he had a very unique view of leadership, and he felt like there shouldn't be a king or a ruler to hinder people's access to opportunity. And so he really pushed for, he got his ideas out about what he thought about leadership. So Dante was the author of the Divine Comedy, and it was marked the end of the Middle Ages, because for the first time someone was challenging and criticizing religion and leadership. And so Dante wrote 3 books in which he described different parts. So we have Paradiso, that described life in heaven, and then the most popular one that we'll get to in a minute, Purgatorio, described life in purgatory, and this was that in-between stage in the afterlife for Roman Catholics. Purgatory. And then you've probably most heard of Dante's Inferno, and in this book he describes life in hell, and he said that there are 9 levels, and the worse you are, the lower and the deeper you go. And so that's one of his really, really famous writings. So I know that you've all heard of William Shakespeare. William Shakespeare wrote 37 plays and 154 sonnets. Now, I firmly believe that William Shakespeare was a literary genius, and that is my personal opinion. But anyone that can write 154 sonnets is just incredible. He was very critical of royalty, and he used comparisons to show outdated views of the Middle Ages, or antiquated. That's what antiquated means, is outdated. And so he wrote comedies and tragedies, but he was inspired by Greek drama. So if you'll think back to the time when last year, when you were studying the Greeks and when you were studying the Romans, and how they wrote comedies and tragedies, he really took ideas from that and really brought characters to life. Now, in his writings, particularly in his plays, the characters were kind of representative of roles of important people. And so that made things very interesting, because they were, some of them comedies and some of them tragedies, they didn't necessarily make those people look really good, if you will. So let's look at quick check number 4. What caused literature to expand, and what was new literature like during the Renaissance? So go ahead and pause the video and write down your answer for that question. All right, section 5, we're going to look at how the Renaissance encouraged changes in scientific thinking, and we're going to look at these scientists. Now, prior to the Renaissance, science didn't exist to the church. It was based on myth, but then it was later supported by the church. So back before the Renaissance, challenging the church on what it taught was very dangerous ground. You just didn't challenge the church. It was called heresy. And if you did that, you were saying that what the Pope or the priest was saying was wrong, and you were going against what the church was teaching. And so this little cartoon right here is an excellent depiction. You've got the people that are reading the Bible now, because now we have Bibles in hand, and they're going, this doesn't really make any sense. And you can see the church leader saying, shut up and believe it. It is what it is. And that is exactly sums up what the church leaders would tell patrons of the church. It is what it is. Don't ask questions. And so the church taught that the earth was flat. It taught that the earth was the center of the universe, and that everything else in the universe moved around it. The church believed that dissecting human cadavers was an egregious sin, meaning it was unforgivable sin. And so, if you'll remember, think back to who was dissecting and who had lots of drawings of the human body. Now, he didn't know that all on his own. So you can only imagine how that knowledge was gained. So one way that the church taught to cure disease was through fasting and prayer. And the church viewed diseases as punishments from God. So go back to part 1 when I first told you that people had lost their faith. They had lost their belief in the church because of all of this mass destruction that had taken place during the plague. And so, they had lost faith in what God was. If this was punishment, then I'm not sure that this is what I should believe. And so the last big thing that the church taught was that everything happens for a reason and shouldn't be questioned. So the church didn't want people to think for themselves. That's the big thing, because when people start thinking, then they start asking questions. So there was a new wave of scientists that came into the picture, and they changed how humans viewed the world. And this was called the scientific revolution. The first major scientist we're going to talk about is Nicholas Copernicus, and he first challenged the church teachings about where the earth stood in the universe. So he believed that the sun was the center of the universe. And if you'll remember, the church taught that the earth was the center. So do you think that Copernicus got in trouble for saying that? He certainly did, because he was going against what a church teaching was. His theory was called the heliocentric theory. And helio means star, which we know the sun is a star, and centric means center. Now, I want you to notice that his initial drawing of the heliocentric theory has all the circles in perfect, they're perfect circles. And so another scientist came along, and he was using mathematics, Johannes Kepler, and he proved that Copernicus was right, that in fact, the earth is not the center, the sun is the center, but he used mathematics to prove that. But he had one other great discovery, and that he found that planets don't orbit in perfect circles, they orbit in ellipses. And so this is what the ellipses are. So the mathematical equation that he developed is below, and then you can see what his drawing of an ellipsis, how he believed that planets moved around the sun. So a little bit different, but the theory is still the same. The heliocentric theory did remain. So I know you've heard of Galileo Galilei, and he agreed with Copernicus, and took it a step farther, and he invented the modern telescope, and he actually used it to discover other planets. He found Jupiter's moons, he found Venus, and he did in fact verify that yes, they do orbit the sun. Sir Francis Bacon, he really changed how we approach science. Now, I'm hoping that you have heard about him in your science class, because he created the process of the scientific method. And so we know that the scientific method has 5 steps, and we're going to make an observation, ask a question, make a hypothesis, we're going to conduct an experiment, and then we're going to draw a conclusion based on what the results were from our experiment, where we're either going to verify our hypothesis or change our hypothesis and then start our process all over again. So that was Sir Francis Bacon. And then I know you all know about Sir Isaac Newton, and he discovered the force of gravity, and that all matter falls at the same rate in a vacuum, and that means with no outside forces acting on that. So air in our environment acts as an outside force. So if we were to drop a cement block and a feather at the same time in a vacuum, they would hit the ground at the same time. If we dropped it in our environment where the air provides resistance, then the feather and the ball do not fall at the same speed, because the air is acting as resistance. So let's look at quick check number 5. What caused scientific thinking to change, and what major scientific breakthroughs occurred during this time? So go ahead again and pause your video and jot down your notes. And then the next part we're going to look at is how religious thought changed during the Renaissance. And so prior to the Renaissance, the church governed everything, every aspect of life. You could not question or disobey what a religious official said. people saw their afterlife as an approval, needing an approval from the higher authorities in the church. And so that caused some issues with some people in the thinking of that. So if you'll remember, we talked about Martin Luther. We kind of addressed him a little earlier. I said we would get back to him. So Martin Luther was a German monk, and he was absolutely disgusted with a particular practice within the church that was known as the sale of indulgences. And basically, what the church did was they charged people for their sins. And it was a sliding scale. So the bigger the sin, the more you paid. And in this picture, you can see the people are lined up. And the man that's standing where my red arrow is pointing is holding a long sheet of paper. And it's got a list. And then he's telling that man who's standing next to him what the right amount is that he needs to pay. And then if you look to the far left, you see the table with the church official behind it, and the man is laying out his coins, paying for his sins. And so by paying these coins, by paying this money, his sins are being forgiven. And so Martin Luther did not agree with that at all. So at this time, the Bible was only available in 3 languages. Now, originally, remember, they wanted to get the Bible in more languages, and they did. But Luther actually translated it into German, and he thought that if he translated it into the German language, that more people would have access to it. The problem with only having it available in the 3 languages is that the people who were churchgoers, they had to trust that the church officials knew what the Bible said and that they were interpreting them right. And so really that became the big issue. And if you think back to the quote that we saw earlier about the church being full of ignorant people, and so they were trying to educate the people of the church. So Martin Luther was very bold, and he wanted to stand up against this abuse. He saw it as an abuse of church power, and he created a list of 95 problems that he found with the church that he thought the church had, and this was called the 95 Theses. And what he did, this was incredibly brave during this time, because if you'll remember, you weren't allowed to stand up against the church. He nailed this list of 95 issues to the front door of the Wittenberg Castle Church. So he took this huge piece of scroll, and he nailed it to the door of the church, and he said, "Here you go, church. Here's 95 things that are wrong with you." Now, I bet you can guess what happened to Luther next. Well, Luther's actions started a major movement called the Protestant Reformation. Now, Protestant comes from the word protest, because that's what he was doing. He was protesting the practices of the church. And Reformation comes from the word reform, which means change. So they were leading protests in a way to change the church. The followers of Martin Luther became known as Lutherans. And today there are over 72 million Lutherans in the world. So, quick check number 6. How did the Renaissance thinking impact religious life? Go ahead and pause and jot your answer down. All right. So this next part is, how did it impact government? So most of the governments during the Renaissance time were absolute monarchs. And that meant, if you think back to when we talked about when you learned about different forms of government, that's when a king or queen has control over everything. Nobody else gets a say so. Well, what happened was, because there was a lot of mistrust, people began to question the relationship between themselves and the government. And this happened at the end of the Renaissance, and it was called a period of enlightenment. And so that's when people started to really think for themselves, and they were like, hey, this isn't right. So I want you to picture people starting to question leaders. So in comes Q. Niccolo Machiavelli. Well, Niccolo Machiavelli wrote The Prince, and he wrote it for the purpose of providing the city-states, rulers of those, ideas or his beliefs on how they needed to maintain control of their city-states, because he was afraid that with all these people doing all this thinking on their own, that they're going to rebel. And so he wanted the city-states to make sure that they had a firm grip on their power over the people. And so he believed that a ruler should be willing to go to any lengths to maintain control, and that your own conscience or your morals should actually take a back seat, which I think is incredibly interesting. So Machiavelli, in his text, The Prince, made these 5 statements, and he said, better for a ruler to be feared than to be loved. Rulers should be quick and decisive in decision making. The ruler keeps power by any means necessary. The end justifies the means. And this is the kicker right here. Be good when possible and evil when necessary. So to me, that speaks volumes. He didn't think that rulers needed to be loved. He thought it was better for rulers to be feared. So then we have John Locke, who, again, remember, we're talking about government. John Locke believed that everyone had natural rights that were given to them by God, and they needed to be protected by the government, and it was the government's responsibility to do that. So he believed the natural rights were life, liberty, and property. Now, he said that the government couldn't take these rights from people because they weren't given to them by the government. They were given to them by God. And so he felt like that the government had no business taking people's life, liberty, and property because they weren't theirs to take. Then we have Montesquieu, and he believed that one person should never have total control over the government, and advocated for a separation of powers where the essential powers of the government were divided equally among groups or men. So I want you to think about what does that sound like? Does that sound like a familiar concept to you? I want you to think about our executive branch, our legislative branch, and our judicial branch. Are those separation of powers? Do we have that in the United States today? The answer to that is yes. And Montesquieu said that all the powers of the government being in one place was a bad idea, and that if we separated them and gave everyone an equal part, that they kept each other in checks and balances. So that's what our government is based off of. Rousseau believe that people naturally enter an agreement with the government called a social contract. Now, the social contract works 2 ways. The people agree to follow the rulers who are ruling in exchange for their natural rights to be protected. But if they feel like their rights are not being protected, they have the right to choose a new government. And so what that means is they can overthrow the government. So what does that look like in a graphic? Well, this is what it looks like. We have the social contract in the middle. We have the people on one side and the government of the kings on the other. And if everything is protected, then the people will give the power to the government. But if the government misuses their power, then the people are going to replace or overthrow it. So it's that's the social contract theory. So Voltaire was he was the believer of freedom of speech. He believed that he may disagree with what you say, but he will defend to the death your right to say it. And so he believed that people should have freedom of speech. Again, is this concept sounding familiar to you? So quick check 7. How did thinking on government change during the Renaissance? Go ahead and jot your answer down and pause the video, and we're going to wrap up. So I want you to think about all the things that we talked about with the Renaissance, and how does this painting reflect the changing society in the Renaissance? Look at what's going on in the painting. Go ahead and jot down your answer to that. And with that, we are going to wrap up today. So thank you for a fantastic lesson.